We'll hit record. All right, welcome. We are so pleased to have you here for another Young Voices Forum. This is a kind of a monthly about series in which we invite distinguished authors from the libertarian classical liberal world, as well as some Young Voices alumni. And today, Alexander Hammond, our speaker, is both. So that is very cool when they overlap. Alex has a new book out, which I'll introduce in just a minute. I am going to ask him some questions, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Just a few notes of housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted throughout the talk. There will be an opportunity to ask him a question at the end for Q&A if you like. We also encourage use of the chat box. So please, while you are listening to Alex, if you have any questions pop to mind, type them in the chat box and I will ask them at the end of the session. Great. With that, I am very pleased to introduce Alex. Alexander C.R. Hammond is the founder of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, a free trade fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and a senior fellow at African Liberty. He is also a program manager at the Rising Tide Foundation. Alexander is the author of Heroes of Progress, 65 People Who Changed the World, and a Young Voices alumnus. And we are here to talk about his book. So welcome, Alexander. We're so pleased to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Casey, and thank you to the Young Voices team for inviting me.
Of course. So first question, what inspired you to write Heroes of Progress, and how did you select the individuals featured in the books?
Yeah, well, what inspired me, I guess, initially, how I started writing this book, it was a very long time ago. It was when I was a researcher on humanprogress.org, which is a project of a Cato Institute led by Marion Tupy, who I think is on your advisory board. And kind of what I realized at the time is, at least now, for well over a decade, there's been all these different projects showing with very sound, clear, good data how much better the world is getting. There's not only human progress, but there's Gapminder, there's Our World in Data from the University of Oxford folk. So there's a lot of resources out there that clearly show us that extreme poverty is declining, life expectancy is increasing, infant mortality is declining, all of that really good stuff. And yet everyone is still gloomy and pessimistic about the state of the world. And this just isn't the case that people are being, that they're just, it's not a silly case of people being mistaken. It's actually fundamentally impacting society and kind of mental health as a whole. And one of the most recent polls that looked at this found that half of all Americans under 30 report feeling anxious all or most of the time. And if you extrapolate that out to the rest of America, it's about a third of them feel anxious all or most of the time. So you've got this situation where, look, if we look at the data, the world's getting better. No one really feels like it is, though. And I think the skepticism really breeds kind of apathy, fatalism, the general belief that we're not capable of overcoming pressing problems of our day. And kind of as cheesy as it sounds, I wanted an uplifting book that clearly demonstrates that the individual has a quite literally boundless capacity to change the world for the better. And there's also an element in the book that demonstrates, from a historical perspective, humans time and time again have overcome seemingly doomsday scenarios, some of which perhaps outweigh what we are facing today. So that's one side of it. The other kind of subtext within the book is looking at the conditions, societal conditions that foster innovation, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then there's another element where it's just, there's all these people out there alive today and in the past who have saved or improved millions of lives, and yet hardly anyone knows their name. Apart from, if we look at maybe war heroes, most people could name like Churchill or Nelson, and you could say George Washington too. But outside of kind of war, very few people can name at least a list of 10 innovators who changed the world. So that's kind of what inspired me. If we're looking at definition, I put it as people who saved or tangibly improved the outcomes of tens of millions of lives. and in many cases, few people know their name. So that creates a huge diversity. I wasn't looking in a specific field. We've got some agronomists like Norman Borlaug, who saved billions of lives with his hybrid crop. We've got intellectuals like Richard Cobden, who changed public policy in the British Empire, and then it kind of spread across the world in a more free trading direction. We've got various business people that raised living standards, or scientists that ended pandemics and created medical breakthroughs that eliminated several diseases.
Fabulous. Yeah, I know obviously there's 65, so there's a lot to choose from. But maybe I can ask you, like, do you have one or two favorites? Can you give an example of one or two of these favorites in a little more detail about these unsung heroes and their specific contributions to progress?
Yeah, it's always hard to choose one. As you said, there's 65, but I think as I'm speaking to an American audience, a good one to look at is one that's very few people know the name of, is Malcolm McLean. And he was this truck driver in the 1950s who created the standardized shipping container. And the way he did that is he was a truck driver. He'd finished high school and his family didn't have enough money for him to go to college or university. So he took a job at his brother's truck driving company. And he was doing this delivery to a port in North Carolina. And he was sitting at the time when he was dropping off his shipment, he had to wait until every item was loaded on the ship before he could leave. So back in those days, everything, and this was only 1937-ish. Yeah, 1937. So back in those days, there weren't standardized boxes that things went in. Each bag, each random sized box, each container was put on individually. So Malcolm McLean was sitting there for hours on the side of the port, I guess, watching these dock workers load stuff by hand. And he began thinking there must be a better way to do this. And it took him about 19 years of thinking about what literally is a strong box. And then he eventually created the standardized shipping container. He managed to get a ship. He then got a fleet of ships. And the moment he got his fleet, prices of shipping on his ship line, cruise line, the delivery company, instantly reduced by about 97% the cost of shipping. And this container shipping now, it really underpins modern globalization. It led to global specialization. Countries far away didn't have to produce everything they consume or sell. It allowed billions of people to participate in the global economy, and undoubtedly helped lead to the collapse of extreme poverty that we've seen across the world. And when he started, extreme poverty would have been about 80%, and now it's about 8%. So, yeah, pretty good guy.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, 65 different heroes. Are there any kind of commonalities you find with them personality wise? Is it grit? Is it, or is there something in the society as well that led them to have that were just the right conditions for these great heroes to flourish? What kind of commonalities do you see throughout the books with these characters?
Yeah, so that's two very important questions. And so it's not a surprise to anyone here or in Young Voices, but freedom is a significant element. And I didn't set out only looking at people in free societies, and I can get onto why there's some exceptions to that. But I deliberately set the book out chronologically to demonstrate the point that fundamentally as freedom grew across the world, as did the diversity of our heroes. Freedom has a very broad sense, kind of freer markets, freer social choices you can make, really kind of began in the Netherlands and England and then spread to Western Europe and the United States and is now increased across the world, even though most people don't think it has. And because this book's written chronologically, you can see exactly that. I didn't set out to do this, but the first maybe 5 to 10 heroes are nearly all English, nearly all men, or if not English, European, Western Europeans, nearly all men. But then as time goes on, it increases. You'll get your first few female heroes as education became more accessible. And it wasn't just, then over time, it wasn't just the upper classes who got education, it was more widely available. So I found that quite important. And fundamentally, we know this because to create ideas, actionable ideas, people must be in a society that allows them to speak freely, to publish, to associate at will, to disagree, and perhaps most importantly is actually to disrupt the status quo. When you create a new innovation that disrupts a marketplace, a lot of entrenched players will be angry. And if those entrenched players are in a cronier system, like was the case almost everywhere 300 years ago, you're going to annoy a lot of people. And then there's a pro-market element as well, where you have to test your idea on the market and utilize the price mechanism, be able to save, and actually to know you own the fruits of your labor, because if you don't own the fruits of your labor, what's the point in doing anything almost? So that's a common thread I found. Didn't set out to, but because it's chronologically ordered of the 65 heroes, we do see that. And then towards the end of the book, it's from tons of different countries. I should say that freedom. There are a couple of heroes that aren't from free societies, and they did one of two things. The first was migrate to find networks, freedoms, education, mentorship in other countries. You see this especially early on in the heroes, where we didn't have. If the United States takes the United States today, people in the United States usually don't move abroad to find entrepreneurial activity. Sometimes they do, but you've got a pretty good setup at home, so you don't need to. But one of our first heroes was Erasmus, who was kind of one of the modern champions of peace and tolerance. And this was back in the 16th, 17th century. He moved from the Netherlands to the UK, to Belgium, to France, to Italy, back to the Netherlands, back to France, then to Switzerland. And this is when it was very difficult to move. So they migrated. And then the second is, if you weren't from a free society, you got special permissions from the government or the rulers at the time. So a good example of this is Sir John Harrington. He was the guy who actually created the modern flushable toilet. And that saved, of course, tens of millions, if not billions of lives, right? With modern plumbing systems. So he was cancelled several times from the English court where he was, but ultimately he'd always find his way back because he was godson of the Queen, and the Queen kind of gave him permission to do his silly things and experiment with things like this. Another kind of much more recent example then would be a guy called Yao Longping. He's probably one of the more unknown heroes. And he was a Chinese agronomist. And during the Cultural Revolution in China in the 60s, the local government reserved a police cell for him, a jail cell, mainly because his thinkings about agronomy were more to the Western tradition than to the Soviet Chinese position. And yes, such a things existed. There's different ideas on how you do plant science back then, and depending on where you fell, depended on if you were loyal to the party or not. So he was targeted, about to be thrown in jail, and it just so happened that a party official from another state read one of his papers, kind of liked him, and he got special permission to continue working. He then went on to develop hybrid rice, which saved at least over 100 million people. Tens of millions rely on it every year to this day. So that's kind of like the wonkish historical policy answer. But then the other side, I would say, looks more at the human brain. And as you kind of alluded to in your question, one of the real common traits is tenacity and grit, really overcoming the haters. So many examples of people who were called crazy, who were dismissed, said they couldn't work on things, and yet persevered and did so. An example could be in another American example, Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering. In the 1930s, they were working in a lab in Grand Rapids, and they were told, maybe because they're women, maybe because it was 1930s and there was no money, that they couldn't work on their vaccine for whooping cough. And yet, so they spent their evenings, their weekends, their holidays doing so in the lab. They're eventually successful, and it saved 15 million people. Same with like Wilhelm Röntgen, who's a guy who created X-rays. When he first told people he could take photos of the insides of people's bodies, people thought he was absolutely crazy, and perhaps rightly so. And yet, probably most people on this call have had an X-ray at some point and benefited from it. But then my final point on the human characteristics is this relentless work ethic does, I think, speak to another personality trait, a broader personality trait, and that's disagreeableness. And one guy who probably takes that to the extreme is actually another American. They're not all Americans, trust me. Another American called Maurice Hilleman. And he's a guy fairly unheard of, Maurice Hilleman. He saved more lives than any other medical scientist in the 20th century. In his lab, he kept a row of shrunken heads on his desk to represent each employee he had fired. He took delight in firing his employees who weren't up to his challenge because he ran his lab like a military unit. He refused to take classes to make managers more civil. But yet he went on to develop over 40 vaccinations in his life. And in America, I believe 14 vaccines are recommended to kids as they're growing up. And of the 14, he created 8 of them. So yeah, there's the tenacity, the freedom, human mind put together. You've got the conditions for innovation.
Amazing. So progress is something I feel like in think tank world and academia has been talked about more and more in recent years. There's an emerging field of progress studies. What do you think are some of the most common misconceptions about progress and innovation that you see in modern times?
I think when we look at specifically innovation and the people behind innovation is what's not well understood by the mainstream. I'm sure young voices, supporters and fellows are more aware of this, but that people are flawed. And to celebrate someone's brilliance in one aspect of their life is to not celebrate and endorse all aspects of their life. And it seems to me the media can't really accept this. Modern day intelligentsia can't really grasp this, because some heroes, not all, but some heroes in the book, separate from their world-changing innovation, committed awful acts. They held morally repugnant views, especially by today's standards, or they were just generally unpleasant. And an example that brings this, I think, to the point most clearly is that of Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. These were 2 Germans about 110 years ago. One was a scientist and one was an engineer. And they developed the Haber-Bosch process, which converts nitrogen from the air into ammonia, which can then be used as fertilizer. So they created synthetic fertilizer. 120 or so years ago, the world was facing a famine, and everyone forgets this because we always forget the potential disasters we avoided. But guano deposits were running out. Guano is literally bird poop. They were mostly found on islands in oceans. That was running out. We were facing a global famine. They managed to discover a way to create synthetic fertilizer, saved hundreds of millions, if not billions of lives. And yet we don't really celebrate them. And look, you can argue for good reason, but the reason we don't celebrate them is because Haber, Fritz Haber, one of the guys involved, went on to develop chlorine gas, which was used in both world wars and killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Then Karl Bosch went on to create nitric acid, which went into various explosives, and he got rich off Nazi government contracts. So, and this is a really extreme example, but we have an inability to even acknowledge these people in the past for their world-changing innovation, even though they committed egregious acts. And that's an extreme example, but even if we categorize this down to like relatively minor cancellations, today, or if we look back at historical figures we don't like talking about. And I think it is just worth remembering that there is this correlation between those who are most technically innovative and then those people having more limited social skills. Their brain usually operates on a scale that isn't well equipped for polite, cordial conversations like we're having now necessarily. That's not always the case. Some of the heroes were incredibly eloquent, could make an incredible speech. But a lot of the times, if you're innovative, technically innovative, it's because you're finding technical solutions to your problems rather than social solutions to your problems. And I think that the implications of cancelling these folks is actually probably an unexplored area in this free speech debate, I think.
Kind of a related question. Are there any heroes of progress that you wanted to include but couldn't? And if so, why?
Yes, so there was none specifically at the time I wanted to include and didn't. I would say the book is definitely not all encompassing. It doesn't include, I'm sure there's some people I missed out. And it's not all encompassing as well because to rank the impact of every person who's ever lived in terms of lives they may or may not have saved is an impossible task. So it's limited in that way. It's also one of the other things worth noting is innovation is often a team sport. It's often incremental, it's collective, it often evolves over centuries or millennia of acquired knowledge. So what I did in the book is take the person who had the clearest and most important role in said innovation. Otherwise, it would take several lifetimes because, and as an example, if I included David Narlin, who created the formula for oral rehydration therapy, which is a huge thing, especially in the developing world. So if we take that, if we got everyone involved in the innovation, would I have to then create biographies for each of his team, his mentor, his mentor's mentor, the person who made the test tubes in his lab, the inventor of test tubes, the person who built his building. So there's this all kind of downstream people who you theoretically could include, but I just had to take the discretion and for simplicity's sake, only include those most relevant. And that's actually why I didn't include things like the invention of the automobile or the plane, because if you ever actually look into that, it's highly contested with dozens of players involved, often across the world. So yeah, they've been omitted. Although I do keep finding people, very occasionally, not often, if you've got any suggestions, send them to me, but that probably should have been included. A few weeks ago, I found a guy called Alexander Wood, and he invented the modern hypodermic syringe. So, when you go get your vaccines or injections, or even, I guess, if blood's taken from you, it's the same needle. He created that needle. So that's pretty important. That saved millions of lives, and I just didn't know of his existence. So yeah, there'll be a few. I've got a list, a document saved somewhere that I'm very sporadically adding to. So yeah.
Yeah, I discovered once when traveling in Brazil that Brazilians have a claim to the invention of the plane, and they were very mad that we Americans thought it was the Wright brothers. So there are some of those that are disputed. Great. I am going to turn it over to some questions. I have some more questions myself, but I want to turn it over to Q&A, and then I can maybe sprinkle my questions in at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, or you use the raised hand function and I will call on you. We have a few already ready to go. So I will start with Jason Reed. Asks, what should we be doing to nurture future heroes of progress? How can we push scientists towards high risk, high reward research?
Well, that's a really great question, Jason. I'm glad you're here. I think one answer to that is, I guess coming into this book, maybe given my policy wonkish background, I thought kind of freedom was the be all and end all. If you give a society freedom, then innovation just magically happens. But I think there is certainly a place for uh, self-belief. If look, imagine you have a free population of billions of people, but they don't actually believe that they can make a change, that they could actually make a product, or develop a method that is used widely, and that they don't have a belief that they should give up their job to pursue this project, or that they can't overcome whatever bureaucracy to set up their company to sell it in the marketplace. So there is definitely a role of self-belief. You could just say, well, some people will have it, some won't, but maybe that is a thing that can be, if not taught, maybe trained. Um, I think when it comes to, if we're looking at scientists pushing them towards high risk research and high reward research, um, I immediately think, maybe because of my current job, of the funding of this. Um, and super risky stuff is only appealing to some donors. And that's a major thing in science. All scientists are supported by multi-million-pound grants in most cases. And indeed, it's the case, many of, especially the early heroes in the book, were independently wealthy. So they could afford just to spend all their days tinkering with little things and seeing what happens. So I think it's developing a culture of self-belief. I don't know if a thing, over at Google, where they give employees 20% of their time to work on their own projects and do whatever they want. I don't know if that's actually successful. Perhaps it is. We could roll that out more. But as you know, I'm not a scientist, so I perhaps can't answer that question entirely. But perhaps more mindset shift training could be beneficial, especially given the state of fatalism.
Great. Caleb Franz asks, which story surprised you the most when you were researching this book?
Oh, that's a good one. I think so. This actually isn't really an innovation, but it's still about a hero who saved the world. This is actually probably the only person who didn't necessarily work for years on his thing, and it just happened to him, or he did something in a moment. And that is Vasily Arkhipov. And this gentleman was a Soviet naval officer during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And it happened by accident that he was in charge of this fleet of submarines. They were all going off to Cuba. And usually, so they're all going off to Cuba. And on their trip to Cuba, they didn't know that the US had implemented a blockade around the island. So they got their flotilla started getting depth charges, which are, they're not really deadly, but they're designed to shake your submarine and maybe get rid of your air conditioning and things like that. They're scary, but your whole submarine is shaking. There was no radio traffic at the time, and everyone on board believed the war had broken out. And usually, weird fact to know, but on Soviet submarines, to launch a nuclear torpedo, you needed the permission of a captain and a political officer. And Vasily Arkhipov, even though he was in charge of the entire fleet, he was only second in command on his specific submarine. So it just so happened he was on that specific submarine. And at the time, the captain and the political officer said, "We are at war. We're going to fire this nuclear torpedo at the USS Randolph, but it's just above." And it just so happened, because he was on the submarine, they also needed his permission. And he said no, he refused to do it. There was, at the time, people were enormously stressed. Temperatures, I think, were up to 120 Fahrenheit. Oxygen was running out, and he just refused to do it. So that has essentially prevented global nuclear war in 1962. There's plans that have been published on what would happen if a strike happened during that blockade, and it's essentially all the capital cities in the Pacific list getting blown up one by one across the world. And the US Security Archive said and declared that Arkhipov, quote, saved the world. And yeah, so it was an accident that he was on board. And if he wasn't on board, nuclear war would have happened. Um, he went back to Russia and he basically spent the rest of his days in the Soviet Navy. People really did not like his decision not to fire in the Soviet Union at the time, and yet he refused. And the final thing I just remembered about the story is it wasn't until 40 years later, where there was some reunion of both sides in Cuba, that this story was told. No one knew until 2002, I think, that the world was that close to nuclear war. So that's pretty surprising.
Incredible. Got another question, and I'm sorry, I'm probably gonna butcher this name, but Shizi asks, "Hi Alexander, do you think being entrepreneurial is a cultural trait? For example, some people argue that the US is innovative because it's got a youth culture versus cultures in East Asia that respect tradition, the elderly, uphold the status quo, etc." So, role of culture in progress.
Yeah, look, it definitely plays. I'm sure it plays some role. And I know there's thousands, hundreds, if not thousands, of social scientists trying to explore this issue as we speak. Um, in my personal experience, I certainly see this. I've lived in many countries. Some are much more entrepreneurial and optimistic than others. Um, and I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and in America and in the UK and in Switzerland and not ever lived, but spent a lot of time in Africa too. Um, I think there can be a culture around it, but I think also people find, especially given the internet and given this kind of globalized world, we do find our tribes, right? The fact I'm speaking to you, a bunch of classical liberals, does mean I found this classical liberal tribe um, in and across America. And I'm sure if I was really entrepreneurial and wanted to create products in I don't know, the water bottle space, I'm sure I could still find my club of people who are working on innovative things in that area. So I think we are quite lucky in that regard. Um, this then does also link to migration, and that's why you have so many people coming to places like America to create their businesses and to try new ideas. As generally economic freedom spreads across the world, I'm not saying it will forever, but it still is if we look at the last few decades. That migration need will become less relevant. But ultimately, yes, I think culture plays a role. And the number of people willing to disrupt the status quo in America, that's very much championed. But even in my own experience in the UK, if you were 21 wanting to set up your own business, depending on your social circle, you might not get as much support as if you're elsewhere. But I think you can still find your tribe if you actually care enough.
Absolutely. Let me pause here. Are there any other questions from the audience? You can, if you don't want to type, you can also raise your hand, or I'll invite folks to unmute themselves. If not, I can ask a few more questions while people are thinking of some more. So, my next question is kind of more personal. What's next for you, Alexander? Are there any upcoming projects or topics you're excited to explore following the release of Heroes of Progress?
Yes. So I can't say that there's a Villains of Regress in the works just yet. Um, but that could perhaps be a funny counterpoint to Heroes of Progress. Next major project, as we're going on a personal note, I guess is fatherhood. As I've got a baby coming this November. So that would take up a hell of a lot of time, and I'm very excited by that. Um, yes, I've got plans for maybe a couple of longer works on. I've been doing a decent amount on the economic development of Botswana, which is completely separate from what we're talking about today. But Botswana is this bit of a weird case where it's, as we know, it's a sub-Saharan African nation, landlocked, most of it's desert, and yet it's pretty rich by comparative standards. It's an upper middle income country, far surpasses its peers. And why is that the case? And there's tons of different theories as to why. And so I've spent some time exploring that. Um, In the longer term, I think a book that's kind of missing in the marketplace, again, about Africa, but as you know, I set up an initiative about African development. So that's kind of been my focus for the last few years. On Africa is after independence, most African nations, apart from Botswana, became socialist. And there's not really a definitive book tracking how that came about, how it came about, why it happened, the consequences of it, and and how this kind of Western ideology, which is actually, I mean, which socialism, Marxism is, dominated Africa, and the immense adverse consequences of that. It took most countries back economically by several decades, and was responsible for most of the civil wars that happened in the 90s. So yeah, really exploring that I think would be quite interesting.
Awesome. Well, we got a few more questions. I am going to skip first to new folks asking questions, because we got a few from folks asking second questions. So first, I'm going to go to Matt Cookson, who asks, are there any heroes of progress that you see currently innovating or making an impact? If so, who would they be?
Well, yes. So depending on how his stuff goes, I mean, in the future, one may even argue now, you could say Elon Musk, right? If it is the case that, and I don't know to what degree it's him or his team, but if he helps make space travel incredibly affordable, or indeed actually goes a long way in getting us to Mars, I think that's pretty important. The dawn of electric cars, um, some could argue that's important. Yes, and so maybe Elon. I must say, I don't really look at new startups doing innovative things. I'm sure there's many people who are very close to ending various types of cancers who should be included if they're successful. Um, yeah, I think, and of course, what's come along, what I think will be probably one of the biggest ones in the next 50, 100 years is, or probably sooner, but really taking off in that time period, is the rise of anti-aging drugs, or treatments, I should say, not necessarily drugs. I think that fundamentally change the world. But of ones I specifically name, I'm not entirely sure because this book was also recent, right? So there are a few living heroes in the book. It was only published in March, so all the living ones. There aren't many. There aren't any living ones I can think of because I would have put them in the book.
Kind of a similar question, not about specific people, but do you have a sense of where the most fertile questions for innovation is today? And I would also ask, that was a question from Aaron Andrews, but I would also ask what you think of like startup cities and other kind of innovations and jurisdiction that are happening to try to incentivize more progress.
Yes. So on the one about startup cities, these kind of regulatory sandbox we see across the world, I really love the idea. I want to see some examples of ones that are functioning and working well today. Um, a lot of people have a lot of ideas for these cities. Um, and I just kind of want to see some work. So I think that's how I feel on them. They certainly could work, but I also have this deep concern on depending on where you're doing it plays a huge role too. If you are going to, I don't know if there's one happening in Chad in sub-Saharan Africa, but if you're going to Chad and setting up a charter city and you successfully set up said charter city and it's very successful, due to the political nature of that country, I think it's going to be taken over by government real fast. And you could argue, oh, but if it's making money, they wouldn't do that. I think for a lot of politicians in a lot of developing world, short-term gains win out versus long-term economic growth of your people. not in all the cases, of course, but I think that that risk is certainly there. When it comes to fields, well, in the book, a decent chunk, not a majority, but if we're looking at all the different fields covered in the book, the biggest chunk was from medicine and the medical field. And I have a feeling that will continue. And as I said about the end of cancer, the end of various diseases we still have today, perhaps life-extending drugs, things like that, I think are still, still there's a lot of room for future progress that you can see happening, right? That you could comprehend happening. The problem with the question of where is fertile ground for innovation is if in the 13th, if in the early 14th century, no one would be able to predict the printing press, or 100 years ago, no one would be able to predict the laptop. So I'm sure there'll be tons of innovations like these. But if I knew what they were, I'd be doing them and making billions of dollars.
So here's a sort of a follow-up question to that, Alex. Do these innovations see sort of like big step forwards? Are they like already, are they aligned with like the cultural zeitgeist at the time, or do they come out of left field?
I think they come out of left field. In most cases, they upset a lot of people. Really, really do. Not always. Sometimes, like if you're Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering and you create the vaccine for whooping cough, which you're in 1930s America and kids are dying from a whooping cough. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if you're Gutenberg creating the printing press, the churches hated that. A lot of established industries around people just writing out books from hand rather than having a printing press do it, which he destroyed. And often in those days, businesses were in bed with government, which of course they still are today, but to a much more significant degree. So yes, I feel it's often historically that they've come out of nowhere. And I think there are countless examples in this book of that. And one of the much more mainstream figures I have in there is Frederick Douglass. And the fact he was able to just do what he did, you wouldn't have deemed it really possible before he did it. So it's, yes, I think left field, but I'm happy to be someone to disagree with me.
Great. Jason Reed asked kind of a practical question. How can Young Voices op-ed writers use the stories of heroes of progress in their writing to support their arguments about innovation today?
Okay, that's a good question. I'd say one example could be is if you're writing about, oh, okay, I've got a good story on this actually. I mentioned earlier Maurice Hilleman, the really disagreeable guy who created a lot of vaccines and kept a row of shrunken heads on his desk. That guy. To create one of his vaccines, his daughter came down with an illness. I can't remember which one. He basically took a scab off her, ran off to the lab, and made the vaccine. One of his mentees later said, and it's a pretty good quote, it said something along the lines of, with today's regulations, that wouldn't be possible. So I think that's quite an interesting angle, is having a look at some of the heroes and the circumstances in which they created their innovation, and to see that it just simply wouldn't be possible in many cases today. So that's kind of a regulation standpoint. From a free speech standpoint, my gosh, the book's littered full of people who didn't get on with others and said egregious things and held morally repugnant views. And yet, if they're around today, they would have been cancelled. And I'm not like defending their viewpoints at all, but they would have been cancelled from their work prior to them creating a world-changing innovation. And that applies to Maurice Hilleman, who we just mentioned too. If he was around today and he kept a row of shrunken heads on his desk, I don't know, but I think he also said misogynistic things. He would have been fired, and look, perhaps deservingly so, but then the world wouldn't have had these 40 vaccines that have saved hundreds of millions of lives. So I think that free speech and regulation angle is clear from the get-go.
Aaron asks, why 65? Any rationale for that number?
Got really tired. No, I 65. Well, so I should give a bit of background on the book actually. So I started writing it as a series of articles on the Heroes of Progress website. And I thought I'd first start by writing 5, maybe if people really love it, 10. But then Cato wanted me to keep doing it, and I did. And we got up to about 50. And I thought that was a good number. 50 was nice and round. And then Cato came to me and said, oh, we've got this series of articles sitting here. They like it. How about we turn it into a book? Oh, but then then we've also, during that time, once I finished my 50 and, okay, let's write a book, I discovered several others, coincidentally 15 of them, who really should be included, and I couldn't justify not including them. The ones I haven't included now, I can say, but I didn't know about their existence when I was writing it. So then I added them. I couldn't find any more. I tried for, literally, I was working on this project as a series of articles. As a series of articles, it was once every 2 weeks for 50. So that took a good few years. I then had a break for 18 months or so, and then turned it into a book. So it's been in the works for at least 5+ years. So I had a lot of time trying to discover new heroes that could fit. I didn't. So yes, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I published everyone who fit that definition, and it was left with 65. So that's the reason. There's no greater meaning to that number.
Do you think, I mean, I guess it depends on how well the book sells. Will there be future editions where the number just climbs? You eventually have 100.
Yeah, you could. I certainly wouldn't be against it. But I think also part of a book is it's not all encompassing. And I kind of like the idea of leaving. It's actually kind of a good selling point where people read it and be like, why didn't you include X person? And then you can kind of have a debate about that. Future iterations, not impossible, but no plans right now. I wouldn't be against it. I joked earlier, a fun one could be doing the complete adverse, the villains of regress. But that would be a very depressing book indeed for people who have killed the most people in the world. That wouldn't be very fun. So no, I'll keep it on a positive note for now and see what comes in a few years.
Jason asks, how can we push back against doomers who put the brakes on innovation because of fear? I'm thinking of those who would feature in a modern version of the Pessimist Archive, for example. For those of you who don't know, the Pessimist Archive is a great website that kind of clips together newspaper articles and other types of historical materials of people massively predicting things wrong, like, oh, radio won't amount to anything, or, you know, cartoon books are dangerous, or things like that. Yeah.
No, it's a really good question. I'd say in a way, like, we can push back against them with historical examples, but let's be honest, we're never going to listen to that. I would just say, like, the Pessimist Archive finds things like people dismissing, I don't know, cars when they were first invented because horses were quicker and more efficient or whatever. But I'd kind of say, like, to what degree do they matter, right? Like, if they influence government policy and add more regulation, okay, that's bad. But if it is just the case they're getting their nice little fee to write their opinion article in the Wall Street Journal saying how silly cars are, it's almost a case they don't have any role to play in the development of said innovation. Like, I don't know, when Louis Pasteur created pasteurization of the germ theory of disease, what he did before that is he claimed that living life couldn't spontaneously appear from non-living matter. And there were articles about him calling him crazy and deluded, but we couldn't stop him, right? It was happening anyway. So I get they can be frustrating, but I hope, and I hope I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong. But in the long term, they don't actually play that big a role if they're just tweeting and writing their silly newspaper articles about doomerism.
Great. I'll call last chance for questions. Type them in the chat box if you will. In the meantime, I'll ask my question, of course, which is kind of a PSA for Young Voices. Can you tell us, about your Young Voices journey, how we helped, and also just give any advice you might have for not just Young Voices folks, but young writers, aspiring writers in general. Yeah, much appreciated.
Of course. We're recording this part, so we can get it for a clip for the website. No, for Young Voices, it really did play a huge role. I actually said this a few weeks ago. I was asked about Young Voices at Atlas's African Liberty Forum. Ibrahim Anoba, who we both know, asked me about it while he was on stage and I was in the audience. So I'll kind of repeat what I said there. And there's several elements to it. There's learning to write is hugely important for your life. I must be honest, I probably haven't written an op-ed in several months, but the experience and the training of being in Young Voices still undoubtedly helps me every day, whether it's writing an email, writing a report, writing the book, learning how to write and then how to speak is one of the most important things I think a young person can do. The value of Young Voices to me is I think it meant I could go for jobs and opportunities I else wouldn't be considered for or perhaps deemed qualified for. I tell young writers this quite frankly all the time. Like, look, if you join Young Voices or even just write by yourself and get in the swing of things, and you are able to write for like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Times or whatever other big American newspapers there are, you can put that on your CV and that stays there forever, right? You don't have to do it 100 times. You don't have to do it over the course of a decade, every week. You can still put on your CV and have this list. And I know everyone in Young Voices now has a list once they've been there for a few months because it works great like that. But that stays in your CV for life. And that means, in my case, I was working on humanprogress.org at Cato. I was in Young Voices. Probably Young Voices dismay. All my articles are about African trade and development, which is annoying because obviously having an American audience is more ideal for bigger name publications and what have you. Anyway, I kept writing about that. And that meant in a couple of years after, I was able to set up my own a think tank initiative on African trade and development. And what helped me get not only other people on board, but funders involved was because I can say, look at how long and how many pieces I've done in all these major publications about that. And whether rightly or wrongly, that gives you an expertise when it comes to getting jobs and getting funding in the future. For those writing a book, so as you know, this book's publication was in quite a weird way. It was a series of articles and then turned into a book. So I don't have too much advice for someone who just has an idea in the first place and wants to do it. But I would say it is a marathon, not a sprint. You don't, I know some professional authors can spend 8 hours a day writing a book and then get it done within a few months. I certainly couldn't work like that. And it's okay to do, providing you remember it 1,000 words a week on it and do that for a couple of years. I mean, you've got 100,000 words and basically a book ready to go. And then you've got much more of a chance to think deeply about it and to know where you're going so you don't feel silly if something's published and you feel like you've missed something out. Take it easy. I'd say utilize Young Voices connections, utilize think tank connections, especially if you're already working at one. Many think tanks in our movement, if you didn't want to book with a major publisher, but you wanted to book out there, many think tanks have a very good book stream that can be utilized and is actually not as scary as it seems. It's a conversation with someone, and the worst they can say is no at the end of the day.
Fabulous. Well, seeing no other questions, I think we can end it there a few minutes early. Thank you so much for your time, Alexander. This has been really awesome. This conversation will be put up on our YouTube, and we will be hosting more future Young Voices forums. So take a look out on your email, everyone, for more invitations. And we also got lots of events planned for the fall in New York City and Washington, D.C., and hopefully in London as well. So we'll keep you posted about all those. Thanks for joining, everyone, and I hope you have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you very much.